I didn't notice the shift when it began because nothing dramatic happened. No announcement, no collapse, just a quiet loosening inside me, like a knot finally realizing it didn't need to stay tight. For a long time, I lived as if my worth depended on momentum, on always moving forward, always explaining myself, always preparing for the next version of who I thought I had to become. Somewhere along the way, I stopped listening to the subtle signals, the pauses between thoughts, the heaviness that arrived not as pain but as resistance. Now I find myself paying attention to smaller things, the way silence stretches without asking to be filled, the way my breath changes when I stop pretending I'm fine, the way honesty feels heavier but also cleaner. I used to believe clarity came from control, from organizing every feeling into something manageable. But lately, clarity arrives when I let confusion exist without rushing to fix it. There are moments when old habits resurface, the instinct to perform, to anticipate judgment, to stay useful, and I recognize them not as enemies but as remnants of survival. I'm learning that growth doesn't always feel like expansion. Sometimes it feels like subtraction, like choosing not to carry what once felt necessary. In these quieter hours, I realize how often I mistook urgency for meaning, how often I chased certainty to avoid sitting with myself. And as that urgency softens, something steadier takes its place. Not confidence exactly, but a willingness to remain present, even when nothing is resolved. There was a time when I measured my life by how well I held everything together, how little I needed, how rarely I let things show, and I mistook that restraint for strength. I didn't realize how much energy it took to stay composed, how much of myself was spent managing impressions rather than listening to what was actually happening inside. Lately, I've been noticing a different rhythm, slower and less impressive, where moments aren't evaluated for their usefulness and feelings don't need immediate translation. I'm beginning to understand that awareness doesn't arrive as certainty, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a soft yes to whatever is present, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a strange relief in no longer rehearsing explanations for who I am or why I've changed, in allowing contradictions to exist without resolution. I see now how often I confused endurance with purpose, how I stayed in patterns long after they stopped nourishing me simply because they were familiar. The shift isn't dramatic, it's subtle, almost easy to miss, like realizing you've been holding your breath only after you exhale. I'm learning to recognize the difference between discomfort that signals growth and discomfort that signals misalignment, and that distinction changes how I respond to myself. Instead of pushing forward automatically, I pause, noticing the impulse, the fear beneath it, the desire to be seen as capable. In that pause, something opens, not an answer, but a gentler way of being present with what is unfinished. I used to think awareness would feel like clarity, like standing on solid ground after a long walk through fog. But instead, it feels more like learning to walk without demanding the ground explain itself. There's a quiet discomfort in noticing how many of my decisions were shaped by avoidance, not fear exactly, but a constant effort to stay ahead of uncertainty. I see now how often I filled my days with motion to avoid listening, how productivity became a shield against questions I wasn't ready to ask. Lately, the noise has softened, not because life is simpler, but because I've stopped reacting to every internal signal as if it were an emergency. I'm learning that not every feeling requires interpretation, that some experiences are meant to be felt fully and left unnamed. There's a subtle shift when I allow myself to stay with unease instead of escaping it, a realization that discomfort doesn't always mean something is wrong. I notice how my sense of self loosens when I'm not constantly defining it, how identity becomes less rigid when I stop treating it like a contract I have to uphold. Old expectations still surface, familiar voices reminding me who I was supposed to be, and I let them pass without argument, without agreement. I'm beginning to understand that presence isn't something I achieve, but something I return to again and again, often after losing it. In these moments, time feels less linear, less urgent, as if it's giving me permission to exist without progress. I don't feel finished or fixed or resolved, and there's an unexpected honesty in that. Instead of searching for certainty, I sit with the awareness that change doesn't require force, only attention, and that listening, truly listening, might be the most radical shift I've made so far. For a long time, I confused being needed with being valued, and I built my sense of self around how useful I could be, how available, how reliable, never stopping to ask what it cost me to stay that way. There's a quiet exhaustion that comes from always anticipating the needs of others, from learning to read rooms so well that you forget how to read yourself. Lately, I've been noticing the tension in that habit, the way my body reacts before my mind catches up, tightening at expectations I never agreed to but somehow accepted. I'm beginning to understand that boundaries aren't walls, they're signals, subtle markers of where I end and someone else begins, and recognizing them feels less like separation and more like relief. I used to believe that stepping back meant losing connection, but I'm learning that presence without self-erasure is a different kind of closeness. There are moments when guilt surfaces, familiar and persuasive, reminding me of old roles I played well. And instead of pushing it away, I let it exist without obeying it. I notice how my attention shifts inward, not in isolation, but in honesty, and how that honesty asks me to slow down rather than prove anything. I'm realizing that care doesn't require constant availability, that saying no can be an act of clarity rather than rejection. In this space between obligation and choice, I start to sense a quieter form of respect, one that doesn't demand performance, only presence. And as I sit with that awareness, I recognize how much of my life was shaped by habits I never questioned, and how gently they begin to loosen when I finally do. I didn't realize how much of my life was shaped by quiet comparison. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle measuring that happens in passing moments, watching how others move through the world and silently adjusting myself in response. Over time, that habit became automatic, like background noise I stopped noticing, and I began mistaking adaptation for authenticity. Lately, there's been a growing awareness of how often I shrink or sharpen myself depending on the room, how easily I trade honesty for harmony without questioning the cost. I'm starting to sense the weight of that constant adjustment, the fatigue that comes from never fully arriving as I am, only as what feels acceptable. There's an unease in noticing this, a kind of internal friction because it challenges the version of myself I believed was open-minded, flexible, easygoing. But beneath that discomfort is something steadier, a recognition that alignment doesn't require approval, only presence. I notice how my thoughts slow when I stop evaluating myself through imagined perspectives, how my breath deepens when I'm not rehearsing how I'll be perceived. Old instincts still surface, the urge to explain, to justify, to soften edges before anyone reacts, and instead of fighting them, I let them pass through without taking control. I'm learning that authenticity isn't a performance of truth, but a willingness to remain consistent even when no one is watching. There's a quiet courage in allowing myself to be misunderstood, in choosing internal coherence over external comfort. As I sit with this awareness, I begin to feel the difference between connection that drains and connection that steadies. And that distinction reshapes how I listen, how I speak, how I remain silent. Nothing resolves immediately, but something subtle shifts, a loosening of effort, a sense that I don't need to become more to be real. I used to believe discipline meant ignoring myself, pushing past every signal, treating rest as a reward instead of a necessity. And I wore that mindset like armor without noticing how heavy it had become. Over time, I learned to distrust ease, to associate stillness with laziness, and that belief shaped the way I moved through my days, always slightly ahead of myself. Lately, I've been paying attention to the moments when resistance isn't weakness but information, when the urge to stop carries more truth than the urge to continue. There's an unfamiliar humility in admitting that effort alone doesn't equal integrity, that persistence without awareness can quietly become avoidance. I notice how my body responds when I choose patience over pressure, how my thoughts become less rigid when I stop demanding immediate outcomes. Old narratives still surface, reminding me of who I'm supposed to be when things get hard, and instead of silencing them, I listen without obeying. I'm beginning to understand that discipline rooted in self-respect feels different, quieter, less performative, and more sustainable. It doesn't rely on force, but on clarity, on knowing when to move and when to remain. In that distinction, I sense a shift from control to cooperation, a way of working with myself instead of against myself. And that changes how I interpret effort, commitment, and rest. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen while surrounded. And for a long time, I normalized that feeling without questioning why it lingered. I learned how to be present without revealing too much, how to participate while staying protected, and over time that partial presence became a habit. Lately, I've noticed the cost of that distance, the quiet ache of connection that never fully lands, the sense of speaking without being heard even when the words are clear. I'm beginning to recognize how often I withhold myself, not because it's unsafe, but because it's unfamiliar, because being fully seen requires a level of honesty I wasn't practiced in. There's a vulnerability in allowing silence after truth, in not rushing to soften it or make it easier to receive. I notice how my body reacts when I stay instead of retreat, how discomfort rises and then settles when I don't immediately escape it. Old defenses still appear subtle and convincing, but they don't carry the same authority they once did. In these moments, I sense the difference between isolation and solitude, between protection and presence, and that awareness quietly reshapes how I relate to others and to myself. I spent years believing that understanding the past was enough to move beyond it, that insight alone would loosen patterns I could clearly name but rarely changed. Lately, I've been noticing how memory lives not just in thought, but in response, in the way my body anticipates outcomes before they occur, in reactions that feel older than the moment. There's a humbling realization in seeing how familiar triggers still shape my choices, even when I recognize them, even when I tell myself I've outgrown them. I'm beginning to understand that healing isn't about erasing these responses, but about meeting them differently, with less judgment and more patience. I notice how space opens when I pause instead of react, how awareness creates a fraction of a second where choice becomes possible. Old stories still surface, quietly influencing my expectations, and instead of rewriting them, I let them exist without letting them decide. There's a subtle power in responding with curiosity rather than certainty, and allowing the nervous system to learn safety through experience rather than explanation. In this ongoing process, nothing feels complete or resolved, but there is a growing trust in my capacity to remain present with what arises, and that presence changes the weight the past holds in the present. I used to believe that becoming myself was something I would eventually arrive at, a fixed point somewhere in the future where everything would make sense and feel settled. But now I see how that belief kept me distant from the only place life was actually happening. There was always another version to reach, another standard to meet, another explanation to perfect, and I lived inside that constant postponement without realizing how much of the present I was trading away. Over time, the effort to hold everything together became heavier than the fear of letting something fall apart, and that shift changed how I listened to myself. I began noticing the moments I felt most alive were rarely the ones where I was certain, but the ones where I was honest, even quietly, even imperfectly. There's a strange relief in admitting that clarity doesn't erase doubt, that strength doesn't cancel vulnerability, and that progress doesn't always look like movement. I've learned that presence isn't passive. It's an active choice to stay when distraction would be easier, to feel without immediately interpreting, to respond instead of react. Old patterns still surface, familiar and convincing, but they no longer define the direction, only remind me where I've been. I understand now that growth isn't about fixing myself into something better, but about removing what no longer belongs, layer by layer, expectation by expectation. In that process, I don't become someone new so much as I return to something quieter and more stable underneath the noise. There's no final certainty waiting here, no permanent arrival, only a deeper trust in my ability to meet each moment as it comes. And in that trust, life feels less like something to conquer and more like something to inhabit, fully, honestly, and without needing to be resolved.